part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hey, thanks for checking out my podcast. Before we get to the show, I know any discussion on politics can be divisive. The nature of the political divide in our nation is so heated and volatile, and I truly believe that is one reason why we find ourselves in the situation today on the precipice of a remarkably historic time that, in my opinion, will either lead us to a more balanced, bipartisan understanding political environment or towards an even more heightened, segregated, hateful future. I'm hopeful, though, and you kind of have to be in these moments. And I wanted to bring someone on, not to put down or bash any one political side, but to help explain what exactly is going on with the January 6th hearing committee. I don't fully understand it. I know it's monumental, but I don't understand the hows, the who's, and the whats. And maybe you do, or maybe you don't, and that's okay. But this conversation has helped me work through some frustrations and difficult questions and really kind of enlighten me on what's going on. Steve Phillips was incredibly kind and gracious to come on the pod and talk with me. He's been everywhere and talked with everyone about all sorts of political issues. He's what you call an expert. Make sure to follow him and check out his stuff on Twitter at Steve P. Tweets. Steve P. Tweets, STEVEPTWEETS. Subscribe to his podcast, Democracy in Color, and pre-order his new book, How We Win the Civil War, on Amazon. You can find all these links in my show notes. Steve knows what he's talking about, and he's a delight. And I think you really enjoy what he has to offer. This was a super fun conversation, and I feel like I've made a new friend. Next week on the pod, I'm going to talk with some other friends, Jason Otero and Gary the Masters. We're going to talk about their podcast, The Ball Card Show, which you can find right here on the Press Play Podcast Network. We talk about the sports collecting and hobby world. It's a ton of fun. It was a great conversation as well. But I can't thank you enough for listening. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a review. Reviews mean nothing other than it just lets other people know that you enjoy the show and that I kind of somewhat sort of know what I'm doing. It's all it does. I'm excited for the summer on the podcast. Big things in store. Please stick around. Again, just thank you for your time. And now let's get to the show. Thank you for downloading the Chase Smith Podcast, proudly part of the Press Play Podcast Network. In this episode, I talk with Steve Phillips, New York Times bestselling author and host of Democracy in Color podcast. We talk about the January 6th hearings, what this means for our nation and our political environment moving forward. Let's get it! All right, here with me, he is the New York Times bestselling author of Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. He's the host of Democracy in Color, a color-conscious podcast on politics. He has appeared on multiple national radio and television networks, including, but not limited to, NBC, CNN, and MSNBC, to name a few. His new book, How We Win the Civil War, comes out later this year. Thrilled to have him with me today, Steve Phillips. Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Steve, we first bonded, and I'm going to say bonded because I feel like there was an immediate bond over our love and consequent heartbreak over the Cleveland Browns.
Exactly.
I had Lindsay, formerly of the Athletic. I don't know if you saw today, she's stepping down and on a new adventure.
Yeah, no, I didn't see that.
Which is exciting for her. She hasn't mentioned what that is yet, but you were so kind. Listened to the episode, sent me a message, and was just very, very kind. Steve, how are you doing with the Brown stuff? Because you love Cleveland sports, not just the Browns, but all Cleveland sports.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Cleveland. I actually realized my dad got season tickets to the Browns in 1964. And then when each of me and my brothers turned 7 years old, he got a season ticket for us. And so I have been a Browns fan since I was 7 years old. I realized the longest organizational connection I have outside of my family is with the Browns. Mm-hmm. And I've been through all the heartbreak, all the years, everything. Actually, I was born in 64, though, which was the last year a Cleveland team won a championship before the Cavs won in 2016. So I've been through it all. So a huge part of my life. And it was just so maddening, heartbreaking, the decision to go against all of that, not just get somebody who's like has almost 30 sexual assault charges against him, but to make that person the highest paid football player ever. Yeah, it was just too much and a bridge too far. And it's really been deeply disappointing. So I really appreciate what you had to say about it. I was like, yes, there is a kindred spirit there.
Yeah. Well, that's just how I've processed it. And then I feel bad for making it about me, because it's not about me, but
Right.
I do want to share kind of my experience through this and how I've talked to my family about it and kind of where I stand. So you were very, very kind with that, Steve. Thank you so much. But all the other Cleveland sports, the Guardians are doing their thing. The Cavs are like rising. It's a very exciting time to be a Guardians and a Cavs fan, Steve.
Yeah, no, I was following online. I was doing some other stuff. The Guardians game against the Twins on Wednesday, and I'm like, oh, 10th inning, we're down by 3, whatever. And then I checked my phone. It's like, wait, we won the game. How did that happen?
Yeah. It was nice to wake up. Josh Naylor is just a beast, man. Yeah. It's a really fun team. The nickname, the Guardiac Kids. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did see that.
That's pretty fun. And a lot of young talent, the Cavs too. You got Garland, Mobley. I know the NBA landscape changes every day. I mean, Kevin Durant. Well, we're not here talking about sports. We could, Steve, which would be great. Steve, I reached out to you, a political expert, because over the past, specifically the past month or so, but really over the last 18 months, is this a really unique time in American politics. And currently there is a Judiciary Committee hearing, and please correct me, Steve, anytime I say something wrong, because I truly wish I knew more about what's going on. About there's a committee meeting hearing about what happened on January 6th, who was responsible, who knew, specifically Donald Trump's involvement, former president of the United States. And if you just look at the headlines and don't understand the process, there's just a lot of big words like bombshell and like hearing and testimony. And there's all these words that you read and like, what is going on? And so I wanted to ask if you can come on and maybe just bring us up to speed on how we got here, what this means, what is going on, and what's going to happen at the end of these hearings. Because to be honest, I don't truly know exactly, Steve, like what's going on or what this means.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's I appreciate the invitation, and it's been fascinating because it dovetails with the research I've been doing for my new book, right? So it can be published by the New Press, and they reached out to me in 2020. So do I want to write a book? And I was like, yeah, why don't I want to use the Civil War as a metaphor for understanding U.S. politics? And then in 2021, people carrying the Confederate flag stormed the Capitol to try to block the transfer of power. Right. And what I did not appreciate until writing my book, which I think is relevant to what's happening now, is that the Civil War itself, the original Civil War, was the result of a chunk of the country refusing to accept the election results. And so 1860 election, Lincoln was elected. First, there was the plot to assassinate Lincoln. And then it was shortly after that the states in the South started to secede from the country. And then shortly after that, less than a year after the election, that they went to war. And were 2% of the population, was the equivalent of 7 million people, got killed. And it all began with the failure to accept an election result, which is really what happened in 2020 here.
Well, that's terrifying. That's a terrifying preamble.
Yes, well, that's as my wife said about the book. She says it's very intense. I said, well, it's an intense time, right? Yeah. So the hearings are an attempt by Congress to get to the bottom of what happened. And so there was set up the bipartisan vote, as in 2 Republicans decided to go along with it. And then and they've been investigating for almost a year. They've interviewed 1,000 different people, trying to get to the bottom of really all the details and facts of what happened. And so they've gathered all that information and evidence together, and they've been rolling that out over the past few weeks. And they've had 6 hearings so far where they've been presenting the evidence in great detail and with real specificity around exactly what happened on January 6, 2021. And
they're presenting the evidence to us, the people, to like who is hearing this information?
Primarily? They're presenting it to the country. So there is that, and there's some level of a precedent or following the tradition of the Watergate hearings back from 1974 and that time period. But they're also, in the more important parts, they're really providing the legal roadmap to the Department of Justice. And so the Justice Department and Attorney General Merrick Garland has the ability to bring charges and criminal charges for what actually happened. And then the big meta question is, with all of this evidence and all of this being laid out, is he actually going to bring charges against Donald Trump for his role? And the committee is laying all of that out.
And he seems to be the gravitational pull of all of what's going on here. Is at what extent did President Trump know that this was going on? What was his role? What was he like telling them to do or not do? And it is just, it's terrifying. It's heartbreaking. If you listen to any part of what's going on, it's just, some of people aren't shocked. Some people are shocked. Here's a question I want to ask, because I think this could be confusing. President Trump, and I'm trying to be respectful calling him President Trump, he was impeached for this.
Correct.
So how is this different than the impeachment trial, which happened like weeks after the insurrection?
Right. Well, I would say two things. I mean, fundamentally, this could lead to criminal charges. Or people have said, I mean, there's a writer, Elie Mystal, writes for The Nation, is their legal affairs writer. And then my wife was saying, how is he not in jail? I mean, that's the thing. If you actually think about it, this is why I was, framing it up around the actual Civil War. And I think part of the significance of these hearings is to stop the efforts to minimize it. Right? Somebody has talked about it, says, well, it was a Capitol tour that got out of control. This was an actual attempt to overthrow the elected government of the United States. They had gallows out. They had built a gallows and were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." They were literally hunting members of Congress, trying to track them down. And so the severity and the significance of that in this country is really, really important. So in terms of so the fundamental question is, are there going to be criminal charges brought against Trump? And are they going to try to convict him and put him in jail? I mean, that is one piece. And then linked to that is the question around, will he be able to run again? So people don't realize, as part of the 14th Amendment, that if you've been involved in an insurrection, you are ineligible for office. And that goes back to Civil War days as well. And so that could also be invoked, depending on how all this plays itself out.
For his role in the insurrection, President Trump was impeached for a second time. This was January 13th, 2021, a week before his term expired. It was the fourth impeachment of U.S. president. Again, Trump has had two of those, 10 Republican representatives voted for the second impeachment. The most pro-impeachment votes ever from a president's party is via Business Insider. It was also the first presidential impeachment in which all majority caucus members voted unanimously for impeachment. Per the New York Times, at the conclusion of the trial, the Senate voted 57-43 to convict Trump of inciting insurrection, though failing the 10 votes short of the 2/3 majority required by the Constitution, and Trump was acquitted. This is from NPR. After the vote on the acquittal, Mitch McConnell said, "It is no doubt that Trump is partially and morally responsible for inciting the events at the Capitol, but he voted against conviction due to his interpretation of the Constitution." Steve, I think, though, this does seem to be centered around Trump. It seems that there'll be other kind of ramifications with other people in politics who have either supported, defended, or justified what he's done. And I mean, what this committee finds could have huge ramifications, not only for President Trump, but for other people that are in politics.
Right. Absolutely. And that everything from criminal to political ramifications. And so there are people who were also part of this effort, which the committee has called a conspiracy. Again, it's a conspiracy to overthrow the elected government of the country. It really needs to be driven home. And so anybody who participated in that, there were members of Congress who participated in that. Rudy Giuliani, who was his lawyer, participated in that. All of them can be subjected to criminal charges and put in jail. So there's that level. And then there's also the political fallout as well. So one of the things that's come up in one of the hearings is the role, or at least certainly the knowledge, that Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson had of all of this, and him being really complicit in the efforts to delegitimize the election. And Ron Johnson's up for election this year in Wisconsin. He's a very vulnerable seat that's held by Republican, could be flipped to the Democrat. Mandela Barnes, who's lieutenant governor, is on our podcast. He's running against him. So this political fallout could also be part of the dynamics here, as well as how all this plays itself out.
Steve, do you remember where you were when you first heard of what was going on at the Capitol?
Yeah, I think it was here at home, but I remember being both on the phone and on Slack with my friends and my coworkers. And I was like, my first thing, which I still have never had answered, is where are the police and where is the military? And how is it possible that people can take over the United States Capitol and hold it for hours? I was like, what if it had been some like terrorist outside force? We just have like been waiting around.
Well, it kind of was a terrorist force, right? I mean,
yes, it was.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying for sure. Like, how was that possible? I had the same thought. And also, if there was like no involvement, why wasn't the president stepping in to say this needs to stop at all? Like, there was nothing. And
exactly,
it was hard to watch that and think that he didn't know what was going on or that there wasn't involvement. Like, it was really shocking.
Well, right. And it's that, and it's like, that's what I'm saying. I think if it had been like a foreign power, and then I don't know if I watched the episodes of 24 or whatever, but if somebody had gone in from a different country that was literally legitimately hostile and taken control of the Capitol, wouldn't there be a swift and severe, isn't this the biggest military, most powerful military in the world? Don't we have people who can actually come in and actually take back control? And that's the thing that to this day still perplexes me, is that how easy it was and how long and slow the process was. So that was a lot of and then some of my friends were also mad because the day before we're big, supporters of the work in Georgia and Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock. And so they had just won those Senate races on the 5th. And before people could even really celebrate, then we have this whole, insurrection thing. So some people are mad about that. My podcast co-host, Charlene Chang, is still very bitter about that. So. Yeah.
I was at church. So I'm in ministry. I'm a student pastor and worship leader here in Columbus, Ohio. And the draw that I had to my phone, I remember just being so scared, frustrated. There was a tinge of like, I told you so. How could you, and you as in just like people that supported what was going on, how could you not see this danger that this could happen? It was incredibly distracting. And we had a student service that night, and it was hard for me to do anything that night. It was just, it was very sad and terrifying. So over the past couple of days, there's been a huge witness that the committee has interviewed, Steve. And for a moment, people didn't know who it was. It was described as a huge bombshell witness, ended up being the top aide of the chief of staff in President Trump's office. Yeah. Why is that such a big deal?
So again, everyone's been trying to downplay what happened, and there's been just like enough distance that you can't fully pin down exactly what Trump was actually doing and his actual role in it. So she was in the room in a lot of these different conversations. And so you actually heard direct testimony from her saying that she heard the Secret Service telling Trump that the crowd was armed. He was mad that the rally by the White House didn't have enough people out in around it, because they'd been keeping people out because they had guns. They didn't want to let them through the metal detectors. And Trump's like, well, they're not here to hurt me. Let them in. So he knew for a fact that these people had been that they were armed. And these are the people that he exhorted to go down to the Capitol. So there's that. And then she was also testifying about hearing how angry he had been, how he wanted to go down to the Capitol and contribute to that. So it's a really kind of a firsthand inside the room testimony, and one of the first people to actually provide that level of evidence and direct witness testimony.
So what do aides do? Like, what would a top aide to a chief of staff of the presidential cabinet do?
Well, part of her job was to sit there and listen and take notes, which is why she makes her a powerful witness. Oh my goodness. Right?
Yeah.
So she wasn't she was an aide to the chief of staff, but somebody has to keep track of what's being said, what decisions are made, what are going to be implemented. And a lot of that was her job, was to be in these rooms. People were talking about how there's, and sometimes even in these very, very high level meetings, that the chief of staff still had her in there, and largely to watch and listen and take notes. And that was her job. And so she has, now I would argue, doing her constitutional and country duty to share with the committee what she actually heard. So that's what that was all about.
What is President Trump doing right now? Because he has been blocked from almost all social media platforms, which I also remember where I was when Trump was blocked on Twitter. For different reasons than where I remember where I was about the January 6th insurrection. But what is he doing right now, Steve? I mean, if what do you think is what's going on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting the terms of him being blocked. I think people have underappreciated the significance of Twitter taking that action. Is that here you have a man who is involved in trying to undermine our democracy, who had instant access to 90 million people. And the dangers of that are enormous. And so for Twitter to take that stand was very significant, I think, in terms of protecting our democracy. And frankly, that's my concern about Elon Musk taking over, is he's going to try to bring Trump back onto the platform. Trump is trying to build his own social media platform. I forget the name of it, actually, but they're actually trying to build their own thing.
Yeah, what is that? Oh my gosh. So I don't remember either. Well, I'd rather not try to look it up anyway.
So there's that piece. What
is that?
I think it's called Truth Social. I think that's yes, Truth Social is the platform that he's actually trying to build out. So there's a little bit of that, and then how much of that's going to be a financial scheme, which is another interesting thing about these hearings. So there's a whole attack on democracy, but there's also the scamming of the public. And so they went to all these small donors to get money to stop the steal, supposedly. But there was no actual efforts that they were doing. They were just using it to build their own coffers to the tune of like $200 million. And so that whole kind of thing went in. But he's trying, fundamentally, Trump has always been about Trump and about his own, ego and platform and his own, trying to make himself as big a deal as possible. He was never, it's really frankly silly, isn't that political a person, but he's found this kind of toxic brew where he can whip people up around this, really a lot of the racial fears and anxieties of many people in the population to build a political movement behind himself. And he's found that this is what actually works best. And it's interesting. That's one of the things I found in my book as well. So George Wallace was the unapologetic segregationist governor of Alabama who opposed Martin Luther King, opposed Rosa Parks. And he is quoted as saying that he first started talking about roads and bridges and taxes, and nobody paid attention. And then he started talking about N-word, and people pounded the floor. And so Trump's had a similar experience, is he's found the political power of whipping people up, and he loves that. And so he's trying to see how he can stay in the mix. Also, he's trying to settle a lot of scores. Anyone who opposed him, he's trying to endorse against them in these different elections to try to get rid of those types of people in politics. And he's trying to remain a kingmaker in Republican politics and position himself for 2024 if he thinks he can easily get into the mix. The other interesting thing about Trump's also fairly lazy, and which is, I think, part of the danger and the reality of what happened is that if somebody were more disciplined and had the level of contempt for democracy that he does, they'd be even more dangerous. But he was more about just his own glory and his own ego and his own being in the news and the media than about actually trying to undermine the government. And so there's a lot of incompetence, but he is trying to position himself to stay, relevant, important, and a kingmaker.
Steve, these hearings will be over here in the next couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, was not 100% sure the time, like the one you just mentioned. It was a surprise hearing, but yes, it's going to be a limited period, probably in the next few weeks.
And one of the things that I've found in research for this episode was Liz Cheney, one of the Republicans who's on one of the two that's on the committee, has mentioned that there have been reports of almost threats to people who are testifying in the nature of Trump, wants you to make sure you do the right thing. He values loyalty to people who are either could be called to testify or, and now all of a sudden that's a whole nother conversation of, tampering or threat. Like it's just, it doesn't seem like there is a spot of where he won't go or won't stop. And that can be really, really concerning. And I want to use that. And Steve, how would you recommend, as this progresses, if it continues to go the way it seems to be going, which very well could lead to some criminal charge? Steve, how would you recommend talking to someone who doesn't quite understand the gravity of what this means, and whether that means they still support them or have supported them in the past? Like, what does that cover just for regular people? And like, how do we have conversations? How do we talk with them about this?
I think at the most elemental level, it comes down to democracy. And do we support and believe in and honor and respect the democracy within this country? And we had an election. Every governor, Republican and Democrat, signed off on the results of their state's election results. And then it's still, you had this mob incited by this president trying to overturn and throw out those results in ways that would get them the end that they wanted. But the question, and then so the kind of the essence of democracy is that if you lose, you respect the process and you let the winner take office and do their job, and you can be loyal opposition in terms of within the bounds of the rules that we've set up. So I think it's a fairly existential question about, is this country a democracy? And fundamentally, is this a multiracial democracy? Or do you throw that out the window when you don't get the results that you want? And so that's, I think, if people are, their parents, or they would tell their kids that you can't just throw everything out because you didn't like what actually happened. But that's the way this has been playing itself out. That's exactly what Trump did and whipped all these different people up to. So to me, it's fundamentally, and that's the significance of these hearings, is that they're laying out the evidence and it's all there. And that we had an election. Part of what they're showing is that they knew that the election results were legitimate.
Yeah.
And they still continued on these different efforts. And
they still perpetuated that was rigged, and they wouldn't stop, and they just kept doubling down on.
Exactly. And they still are. So I think that's the fundamental question, I think, to just the average person, is that, do you believe in democracy? And if you believe in democracy, then we have to protect it. And then when it is attacked, there has to be consequences for it. And that's actually why the Justice Department should act, is to show other people that you can't get away with trying to overthrow this country's democracy.
So this committee, and I'm glad you're up, the Justice Department, they will present their findings to the Justice Department, and they will decide if they're going to press charges or take further action.
Correct. This will all go over to the ball goes in the Justice Department's court, and they will then decide what they're going to do and on what timeline and who exactly they're going to go after.
Do you think
to hold accountable?
Another byproduct of this hearing is hopefully giving other Republicans or conservatives an off-ramp of Trumpism? Like this is the time to cut ties with your support or with your backing of this movement?
Yes, that has been an encouraging aspect of it. And even though they're still trying to attack people who do that. And so, that's one of the things I naively actually thought right after the insurrection. I was like, okay, well, now finally people are going to see, and they're not going to be able to continue to just blindly support this.
Right.
But, I think, I don't agree with Liz Cheney on pretty much anything except that we should have democracy in this country. But she is standing up in this regard and doing and playing this role. The Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona, who they tried to pressure to throw out the results and to put in a fake set of electors, he resisted that and stood up to that. So there are some people who have stood up to the attack on democracy. And you're also seeing it play itself out in the elections. So not everybody that Trump is going after in these primaries, he's not succeeding in defeating many of them. And so to the extent that you can show that you can stand for what is right and still have some electoral viability, it will hopefully give more people more courage to do what's right.
All right, Steve, we're wrapping up here. Look into your crystal ball. What's going to happen? Like what's the outcome 1 month, 3 months, and a year from now? Like paint us a picture. Hopefully
well, the hearings themselves are quite, they're going to be, I think, very historically significant. And I think that's part of why they've been doing it. And they've actually learned about how to convey this kind of information in a compelling fashion. And so in a similar way that the Watergate hearings were significant, I think that these will be significant in the broad sweep. And then we will look back on this historical period, and this will be part of the record that there was, in fact, an attempted insurrection. I don't know, I'm not overly, the ferocity of the Trump supporters is very intense, and it's not clear to me that the determination of the Justice Department, which was ironically created to hold the Confederates accountable after the Civil War, that they will have the full fortitude. But I think I'm cautiously optimistic that the overwhelming amount of evidence that the committee is providing is going to lead the Justice Department to have to take some action. So that's my hope.
Well, I'm an optimist, and I choose to be hopeful in these situations, Steve, because I just don't want to live any other way. It seems awful. And I like getting up in the morning. So I don't want to be pessimistic. Well, I was super hopeful about this conversation, Steve. You just have been the best. And I consider you one of my newest friends. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been fantastic.
Thanks for having me. The Cleveland diaspora is strong, and the Cleveland you have to be full of hope to be a Cleveland sports fan. So
that's right.
To connect with you.
That's right. Hey, plug some things, man. Let's. Where can we hear more of you? And when's this new book coming out?
So Democracy in Color, democracycolor.com. People can sign up for our newsletter. We do a weekly newsletter. It'll keep you in the loop about politics, about all the different things that we're doing. So that will be the main thing people to sign up on. And then the book comes out October 18th. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon or any of the other platforms. And those are the two big things we're focused on.
I will include democracyincolor.com and the pre-order link in the show notes. Steve, you've just been the best. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Yeah, that does it for this episode of the Chase Smith Podcast. Thank you all so much for downloading and listening. Shouts to the Press Play Podcast Network for making this possible. Follow us online at Press Play Pods. Visit our website at pressplaypodcast.com to keep up with all of our shows and other network news. You guys have a great day. I'll talk to you next week. I have the host of the Ball Card Show wanted to talk about sports card collecting. We talk a little crypto and hobby and the growth of that market. So thank you guys so much. See ya.